All right, we are now live for another political theory and practice discussion. Today, we're going to be talking about school reopenings in the time of COVID-19. Mostly going to be focusing on my end on what I know best, the American situation, but of course, we can talk about what's going on internationally as well. So, just a brief rundown of what I'm going to do. I'll talk for about maybe 20 minutes or so, give you some of my thoughts and some, things to think about, some issues to consider without trying to provide answers to everything in the first 20 minutes or so. And then I'm just going to take questions, comments, and respond to those. So, the general issue is that of reopening schools. And when we say schools, we mean K through 12 education, and we also mean higher education, that is colleges and universities, in the time of COVID-19. So there's a lot to be said about this. I'm obviously not going to try to cover everything, but here's what we're going to do. We're going to think about, what political theory is actually applicable to this. And I'm not thinking so much that there's a single idea like the social contract to pick up on, but rather a number of different concerns, and we might do some theorizing as we're going through this. Um, and I think in this situation, we're not trying to find some sort of ideal, covers everything solution. We're sort of looking for least bad ways of doing things. I also think we need to discuss, especially for the international audience, something that I've brought up a number of times in these discussions, which is the particular situation that we're in here in the United States that I think a lot of people from the outside don't really understand or appreciate. They look at our booming coronavirus cases and they're like, what's going on there? And they don't understand how failure of leadership on the federal level, sometimes actually handicapping things, and coupled with our intense localism, has handicapped us in ways that many other countries are not facing. Certainly, none of the other developed countries are in the same boat that we're in. So I will talk about that a bit. And then some of the issues that I wanted to get into in particular, one is analogous to that Vietnam War metaphor of destroying the village to save it. And I think something is going on like that, sacrificing a generation in order to save it in terms of education. We also need to talk about disadvantaged and underserved children and populations, groups, communities, and the impact that face-to-face and online education has on them. Um, I want to talk also about a long-standing lack of priority in our spending and our decision-making here in the United States when it comes to education, when it comes to the coming generations, and when it comes to all the other things that are connected with education, like, say, childcare. I think we also do need to talk about the problem of leadership here in America, which is intensified by localism, particularly when it comes to educational leadership. And then I do want to talk about the social contract because there is indeed an entire, generation that we're talking about here who does, in large respect, feel like the social contract has been broken for them here in America. And that might not be the case in other places overseas. And I mean, my students articulate this to me in classes when we used to meet face to face. We do talk about this a little bit. Actually, we did talk about this in my intro to philosophy class with Milwaukee Institute of Art and Design this summer. So those are the big things I want to talk about. And also we could talk about one other thing. Well, what do you do concretely given the screwed up situation when you're a kid? Something that I'm actually facing with one kid still down in Indiana, which is not a good state for COVID, not a good state for education. We'll talk about why in a bit. And the other coming up here to University of Wisconsin, Milwaukee, where they've made some, remedies, some plans for COVID, but none that really seem adequate. We're going to talk about that as well. So before I jump into some of these things, let me answer a question from Mark Smith. So the shirt is 414, which is the Milwaukee area code, 414 Justice. It's a shirt that supports the Black Lives Matter cause here in Milwaukee. We have had marches and protests going on since the very start. As a matter of fact, one of our key organizers is currently leading a march from Milwaukee to Washington right now. They are somewhere, I think, in Indiana at this point. That's been going on for quite a while. So 414 is a Milwaukee thing. Used to be the local area code. Now it's the code for cell phones. All right, so let's talk a bit about the conditions here in the United States. I mentioned that we have a tradition of localism, and I think a lot of people don't understand this from the outside. So when it comes to policing, when it comes to prisons, when it comes to education, when it comes to public health, there is no system. People, who live in other more centralized countries think, well, you can just fix things from the top down. And you can sometimes do that in America if you actually have leadership at the top, and we're lacking that, and we'll talk about that in a moment. But in general, we have this long-standing tradition of very localized institutions that are serving communities. They all have their own budgets. They all have their own decision-making processes. So just to give you an example, here in Wisconsin, we had a statewide masking, social distancing mandate that the governor of Wisconsin, that's the state that I live in, put out. And the Republicans, who, because of gerrymandering, control the legislature, even though they only have about 44% of the population voting for them, the Democrats actually had a greater majority. They control the legislature, the Republicans, and they sued to the state Supreme Court, dominated by Republicans, appointed by previous Republican governors, who viewed the mask mandate as tyranny. They were using this sort of crazy language, and they got it quashed. So here in Wisconsin, from that point on, it was the Wild West. Any community could do anything it wanted as far as masks, as far as social distancing, closing restaurants and bars. People streamed up from Chicago to Wisconsin to hit the bars here, bringing COVID back home with them. Here in Milwaukee, the largest city in Wisconsin, it's close to, I think, 800,000 or so in the city, and then we have all these suburbs. Here in Milwaukee, the health department and the mayor put in place some pretty stringent requirements, which are not being followed, unfortunately, when it comes to masks, but are being followed when it comes to restaurants. But one county over, Waukesha County, hardly anyone wears masks. All sorts of things are open. The places that are actually following good mask protocol and social distancing are corporate chains like Chick-fil-A, because they don't want to get their workers sick, and they have to do business outside of Wisconsin, say in places where people are being more reasonable about this. And so, when it comes to what we're going to do about COVID in general, it's totally up to the states. It's totally up to local municipalities. Some states kicked it down, like Texas did for a long time, to all the local counties. Some other states have actually passed legislation, or the governor issued orders that would prevent local communities from exercising much control. So that's like public health stuff. When it comes to education, it's even worse. Every little school is part of either its own entity, or it's part of some larger entity, which is going to be local. And how these things are paid for varies from state to state, from county to county. There are incredible disparities in funding for education, in the rules for what's going to go on. Schools will typically have a school board, and then there'll be a superintendent, and the superintendent might be hands-on, or the superintendent might be, a complete washout. And then there'll be a board for the county or the school district, or in Indiana, the school corporation. And so there's no uniformity. And what happens in one school may be totally different from what happens in another school. My kids down in Indiana, in two schools that were actually in the same county, totally different calendars. Spring breaks are at different times. How the teachers are treated differently varies. So when it comes to COVID, there's a lot of variation between the schools. Some are taking it very seriously, some are not. Milwaukee public schools are not meeting face to face. They are starting totally online. And we have some of the poorest zip codes in the nation in Milwaukee, but they're being served because the Milwaukee, public school, district has its proverbial crap together. That's not the case in many other places. And so we have incredible challenges in doing anything that's going to be effective when it comes to these sorts of issues. Putting aside COVID-19, even when it comes to like, how should schools be run? What should day-to-day life look like? What sort of educational theories should be used? What textbooks should be used? We have this patchwork of it's like a mosaic. It's not a map that's unified. It's a little bit here and there and here and there and here and there. And you can make some generalizations. You can say that, schooling in Mississippi is in general much worse than, say, here in Wisconsin. But there are some school districts here in Wisconsin where it's as bad as Mississippi. And there are some good places in Mississippi, usually where they have plenty of money. So this is something that needs to be addressed. Now, Barklord has a thing here. Education is paid by local property taxes. Some of it is, some of it isn't. Some of it comes from the states. Some of it comes from grants. Some of it comes from this. You cannot generalize. That's part of the problem. You can't just say, oh, it's all local property taxes. That's part of it, but that's only a little bit of it. There's so many moving parts. So when it comes to doing things to protect children and to protect other people from COVID, some schools are doing a good job. Some schools are doing an incredibly mediocre job. When it comes to higher education, we're in the same boat as well. There are regional accrediting bodies, some of which are actually quite lax. I am very unimpressed with Middle States and with North Central by comparison to SACS, which is the one that covers Southern universities and colleges. I've seen places where essentially the proposals and plans that are provided to these educational overseers are fiction and nobody actually checks on it. We also have over 2,000 institutes of higher education. Some of them are part of state organizations, right? They're part of the state schools. I mentioned my daughter's going to UW Milwaukee. That's University of Wisconsin Milwaukee. But what happens in UW Milwaukee can be totally different from what happens in UW Oshkosh, totally different from Stevens Point. We add in all these other schools. Just here in the Milwaukee area, we have University of Wisconsin Milwaukee, we have Marquette University, we have Mount Mary, we have Milwaukee School of Engineering, Milwaukee Institute of Art and Design, Milwaukee Area Technical College. All of these totally different organizations, totally different entities, all of which are setting their own sort of thing. Marquette is opening face-to-face. I don't think they're going to remain open face-to-face. UW Milwaukee is opening face-to-face. Milwaukee Institute of Art and Design opening face-to-face, but in a very restricted way, and they've got some really serious plans in place. Milwaukee Area Technical College opening face-to-face only for lab and practicum classes and studio classes, but I think that their plans are not really going to work, and they are a really dysfunctional institution when it comes to planning and stuff like that. So I think they're going to have some real trouble arising. Plus, they're often serving underserved students, so there's going to be a lot of people falling through the cracks despite our best efforts. So, and this is just in the Milwaukee area. We could expand it to the rest of Wisconsin. We could expand it to the rest of the nation. We are a mess when it comes to this. And when you read their COVID plans, which I've been doing, because I'm privy to emails from about 5 different institutions of higher learning, you read these plans, and some of them you're like, well, that's going to work, but that's not going to work. No way. All it's going to take is a couple frat boys who don't want to follow the rules, and you're going to have a COVID outbreak. or pick whoever else you want as sort of like lazy slobs who think that they're entitled to not follow protocols or don't take things seriously. It doesn't have to be frat boys. It could be anybody else you like. Now, we've got some serious issues here. So the localism thing is a big problem. Lack of leadership from on top. Normally, the Department of Health and Human Services would be heavily involved. The CDC would be heavily involved. Department of Education would be heavily involved. But under the Trump administration, unfortunately, where cronyism and corruption is the name of the game, these are very ineffective. You can bet that somebody like Betsy DeVos is not going to do anything to help anybody. She's not an educator. She doesn't know anything about education. She was a big donor, and she got put in charge of the Department of Education because that's the kind of show that this administration is running. So we're in some serious problems. When it comes to leadership, we also have a problem with local leadership. So what I'm going to say here will probably offend some people, and I'm generalizing. There are some really good superintendents, high school principals, people in charge of higher education, but for the most part, they're garbage. They're not well educated. They don't know much about education other than what they took in educational leadership classes. Some of them have never stepped foot in a classroom. Some of them haven't been teaching for years and years. And, it's amazing when you deal with high school principals, how dumb some of them actually are. And these are the people making the decisions. You're like, how did you not predict this? How did you not think about this? And I can say this as a parent. I can say this as somebody who's done, a lot of engagements with other educators. Don't take for granted that your educational leadership team at any given place actually know what they're doing, or have good character, or are ethical, or pick any of these sorts of things that you want. We can't predict that, and it varies from place to place to place to place. Now, unfortunately, we're stuck in a situation where if people screw up over here, it might have impacts on other people over here. So that's some of the situation in the U.S. I'm going to run through some of these issues pretty quickly. There is this really interesting discussion that's happening where over and over again people are saying, oh, there's a danger of significant learning losses. That's the catchphrase that's being used by educational experts and leaders if we don't go face to face. Here's something worth thinking about. Is this a sort of, like I said, a let's destroy the village to save the village sort of thing? Are you actually getting good education from a masked up teacher in a socially distanced classroom where you can't really hear people and the vents have to be running all the time and we're so distracted by trying to follow all these protocols? Do you think that's going to be significant learning going on there in these face-to-face classes? If you do, you want to rethink that. It's probably better to actually have online opportunities for learning. The other thing, too, is somebody pointed out in Twitter, and this is just brilliant, having your parent die on you because you brought COVID home, probably a bigger blow to your education than missing some months of school. I can tell you, as somebody whose dad died in between the summer of 6th and 7th grade, that really did affect my school performance, and it also affected me emotionally, and I don't know how much damage it did to me. I certainly did a lot of damage to my sister. She never graduated from high school. It screwed her up so much in so many different ways, with other family dynamic stuff. So the idea that we're just going to send these kids off and then everything's going to be great, we're going to follow these rules, none of the parents are going to get sick, none of the teachers. This is just pipe dream stuff, And so I think we really need to be thoughtful. We have a duty, a moral duty, to think about what's actually good for these students when we're making decisions for them, or at least the people who are making those decisions ought to. Those of us who can advocate ought to do that. We also have this big problem of underserved and disadvantaged kids in communities. So as a laptop like the one I'm on at home. Oh, here we go. We just had a internet outage right there, right? So you can have internet interruptions. Some places like Milwaukee Area Technical College are expanding their Wi-Fi so that students can actually come over by the school and use the school's Wi-Fi. But that's one of the key things that we can do. There's a lot of danger of the kids who are not in the rich school districts who are struggling, falling through the cracks, and we have to devote resources to that. Instead of bailouts for big corporations, maybe that's where some of the money ought to be going to. This leads me to another point: the lack of priority given to education and to children in general in the United States. We give a lot of lip service to excellence, and we're going to prepare people for 21st century jobs. Most of that is smoke and mirrors. Very few people know what's going on with education. There's a lot of compared to other places, we're not getting much bang for the buck for the money that we spend on education, and we're not doing it very well. And part of this is that incredible localism, and part of it is terrible leadership on top from both the Trump administration and some previous administrations and Congress. So there's some real issues there. This leads me to the last thing, and we're getting close to the time. Actually, we're over the time that I spent that I was going to talk about. There's a risk of a completely broken social contract. I think that for young people in Generation Z and the very last of the millennials, we can talk about people making vast decisions for them and putting them at risk in many different ways, claiming to care about them, but not really doing so. I'll just give you a few examples of pre-COVID stuff that were driving this home. And my students were talking about this with me. Gun violence, totally ineffective controls on that here in the United States. Fortunately, the NRA is finally under attack because they've been allowed to short circuit things for so long, and the Republicans and many Democrats went along with them, essentially whoring themselves out for campaign money. Funding and inequalities. We have massive inequalities when it comes to education here in the United States. Many students can look at their schools and say, I've been kind of hung out to dry. And that's not just a this generation thing. That's a previous generation thing, and that was also going on for my generation as well. This whole notion of preparing people for 21st century jobs. Most of the people talking about that don't have a clue about what these 21st century jobs are. Students just find out that they can't take these classes, they have to take these classes instead, and that they have to do a lot of standardized testing in order to make things work and all that. These are all just things that were already there for students. Now students can look at their educational institutions and the politicians and say, wow, these people do not care about us. They're hanging us out to dry. They don't care if we get sick. They don't care if we get our parents sick. They don't care if we get our teachers sick. They're cool with that, so long as they can say that they've accomplished opening, or and it's clear when you see these sorts of things. One of the schools that I gave you in the reading list, they say they can't enforce mask mandates, right? They're socially distancing. They're not socially distancing. They took pictures of that school. The kids are right up on top of each other, and they're not wearing masks. And the reason they're not wearing masks is because the school says, despite the fact that they can impose a dress code, mostly falling on the girls, and they can expel students for that, wearing a mask is a personal choice. Students are seeing through this bullshit. And they're saying, wow, these people do not care. They care about other things more than they care about us. And that's a real problem. So let's take some of these questions and comments. So Mark starts out by saying, how would you articulate the distinction between the ethical and the legal, as people seem to conflate the two? I ask because it seems this issue around schools might cause a potential clash between what rules demand and versus what the ethical choice might be. Part of the problem is that the rules in many cases are not the right rules. Like I just pointed out with that school, if they can enforce a dress code, right, and they can police whether girls are showing shoulder or something like that, they sure as hell can say, mask up, dummy, or whatever you want to say to some kid who doesn't want to wear a mask or wants to wear it, not over their nose. It's the administrators who don't want to do it. It's the people in charge who gripped by an ideology, essentially, because it's clear. Even if you thought that masks aren't really going to help in a major way, it's the right thing to do. You know, you even if it turned out like with a Pascal's wager that masking up didn't really affect anything, since we don't know, or since we do actually know because the studies have shown they are effective. But let's say you didn't know, it would be the right thing to do, right? And washing your hands. I mean, it's amazing. This is a little bit of a rant. It's amazing that people are resistant to the idea of washing their hands and basic personal hygiene because someone else told them to. This is a real problem here in America. This sort of like my freedom, my liberties sort of nonsense that we've got. I don't know what we're going to do about it, but all right. Let's see here. Skip says, glad you've been keeping these going. Yeah. I think it's a good thing to do. Here we go from Logan. Do you think compulsory in-person lecture class attendance is necessary for education, similar to compulsory mask mandate necessary for reducing coronavirus cases? So that's a great question. And the answer is no. We've been doing online education, some people rather poorly, but some of us very conscientiously and well, for decades. It's been going on for decades, and it's been getting better and better and better. There are entire organizations out there like Quality Matters devoted solely to reviewing online education classes and curricula and saying, hey, you should fix this. Hey, this is the best practices over here. No, you don't have to have in-person classes for everybody. Now, not everybody is cool with online education, right? Some people genuinely do need to have the face-to-face thing. And I like teaching face-to-face classes. I kind of miss being there with the students and getting to be in the same room and stuff like that. But I also recognize that that's not absolutely necessary. I will say this. Online education requires different skills and different approaches than face-to-face. The people who think that it's just about having Zoom meetings and, putting a few exercises online, they don't actually understand online education. And if they think that's what the case, then they should just sit down and shut up and not talk about it, right? And let the people who do know about it be the opinion formers and policymakers. Again, good reason why Betsy DeVos should not be in charge of the Department of Education. She doesn't have a clue about teaching or education, right? We should have somebody in there who's an actual educator who can lead and promote the right policies. We don't actually, unfortunately, have a compulsory mask mandate that's being followed. Even here in Milwaukee, we have a mandate, but it's not being enforced. So I don't think that there's a direct analogy between those. But we do need to think about why it is that people are so insistent on face-to-face classes, and maybe we can come back to that in a bit. All right, Skip. Rightly so. I personally feel no loss of freedom while wearing a mask. Yeah, I mean, here's the thing. If you actually feel like your rights or your freedom are being impinged upon by wearing a mask during a pandemic, you've got some psychological problems that you really want to take a look at. That's what I would say. Probably debilitating ones. If you feel that great of an outrage or fear or any of these emotional responses to wearing a piece of fabric in front of your face, which may in fact keep you from getting sick and may keep your loved ones from getting sick and will certainly conduce to an environment of less people getting sick. If you don't want to do that, you're basically an asshole. However you come down to it. And you could be an asshole because you just like to be an asshole, or you could be an asshole because of fear, or because of, some weird ideology of personal freedom, and this is tyranny. But that's really what it comes down to. And these people who are hysterics and they say, oh, I put a mask on and I walked around and I started getting out of breath. I walk around here in Milwaukee, and I'm a fat guy who's in his almost 50 years old, walking around in 90-degree heat with a mask over my face, walking 5 miles, and it doesn't bother me. I mean, the mask gets all sweaty and stuff. Sure, that's a minor inconvenience. That's because I've got this big, thick beard here, right? But these hysterics who say, "I put on a mask and I had trouble breathing," this is nonsense, and we really shouldn't take any of those people seriously, other than to tell them to get them psychological help. I think. Zeno, how do we incentivize better leadership in public education? I don't know. I don't know that we can incentivize it. I think part of what we need to do at this point, it's a great question. We do need to think about that long term. I think what we need to do right now is a lot of pushback. I think we need to demand that educational leadership be accountable, and I think that we need to do whatever it takes to get the bad leaders out. And then, so that's sort of a very short-term strategy. And then when we have, more time, we can think about how do we get good leaders in. Part of that is thinking about what characteristics we want in leaders. So in terms of universities, I would say that one of the things we want to think about is leaders who are not just about the bottom line, because a lot of these people who are, president, chancellor, VP, dean level. The deans are often in small places, promoted from the faculty, but in a lot of places they're not. And so all these executive leadership positions, they're mostly people who are about budgets, keeping the bottom line going, and in the case of presidents, schmoozing to bring in money for the university. So we want people who have genuine educational experience, and we want people who are ethical. That means that they're going to be caring about the students more than they're caring about the financial bottom line of the university, especially if they've got big endowments. I don't want to see universities that have $100 million endowments telling us that they can't do this or that. They probably also need to start putting money away for a rainy day so that they're not so radically dependent on people being in the dorms. And they need to quit spending money on bullshit things. Maybe they need to quit spending money on athletics so much and start firing some of the head coaches and getting cheaper ones. The alumni might not like it, but if you're in leadership, you're there to do the tough decisions, not just the easy ones. Maybe we shouldn't be spending so much on new dorms. Maybe we should be focusing on how we're going to reconfigure classrooms and build out IT structures so that the next pandemic, we're not faced with this problem. So those are some of the things I think we need with leadership. When it comes down to K through 12, man, that's a tough one, because you don't need quite so much to become a principal or a superintendent. A lot of it is about personal contacts and hanging out with the right people and being friends with politicians. But it totally depends on the area that you're in. And I mean, I'll put it to you this way: we actually have people who are educational leaders in our building who don't wear masks in our building in Milwaukee. And you're like, what in the hell are these people thinking? So I think there's a lot of criteria that we can come up with for what good educational leadership would look like. But right now, our goal should be on getting the people who are ineffective, getting them out, or at least putting pressure on them to become more effective. All right. Sam says, is a political theory means just a philosophical position, hypothesis, or STH like that, or STHL? So I'm not sure what that's actually meant, but political theory is not a single meaning term. It covers a wide range, and I mean, it's been around for a very long time. Hey, politike episteme, Aristotle called it, right? The science of politics, or the discipline of politics. And so it can cover very abstract discussions all the way down to the sort of things that we're talking about here. Gutter says, people say it's about the kid's education, but that's a euphemism for free babysitting. I would avoid any sort of sweeping statements like that. when it comes to this incredible patchwork, so you can't really even effectively generalize about education in the United States. But even so, if you just focused on one school, I'm willing to bet that there's plenty of parents and teachers and kids for whom it's not just free babysitting. So those sort of comments are not particularly productive. That said, if we change it a little bit, there is a really significant issue at play. It's not about babysitting; it's about child care. And the issue is this: if we're having kids stay home from school rather than going off to school, where they have the risk of getting infection or carrying infection home, we do need to address the issue of how these kids are going to get not just a productive education at home, but what to do with all the parents who still have to go out to work. If you're a janitor cleaning up at one of these schools or cleaning up at a hospital, so you're an essential employee, right? And your kid has to do online education because they're in the Milwaukee public schools and they haven't yet moved back to hybrid and face-to-face because we're not at the point with coronavirus where we can. What do? Do you just leave your kid at home and say, all right, Johnny, go to it? I mean, that might work with a 12-year-old. I mean, I grew up in the generation where we were called latchkey kids for a reason, right? Because we were on our own a lot of the time because oftentimes both parents or single parents worked. But I don't know about like a 6-year-old. You got to have somebody watching them. So this is a genuine issue. I just wouldn't put it in such a demeaning term as babysitting. I would call it child care. And I would say that this ought to be a major priority for us, right? This is a priority for not just government, but also education and also corporations. All right. Zeno says, I didn't notice much of a difference in my learning shifting to online. That said, most of my classes are humanities and social science. Yeah, so again, use my daughter as an example. She signed up for 5 classes at University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, and she has a musical theater major. And like one of her classes is an honors class, sort of like a humanities class. Another, I think, is like history of theater. Those both went online, and I'm like totally happy. I don't want her being any more put at risk than she has to. Her other 3 classes right now are still face-to-face, in part because they involve movement, right? So like she's got a ballet class. It's kind of hard to do that online, and this is why places like Milwaukee Institute of Art and Design and Milwaukee Area Technical College have said studio classes, practicum classes like those that nurses do, and lab classes will probably still have to be face-to-face for the time being. Now, that may change as well. So yeah, there are some things that are very easy to put online. The kind of stuff that I do, philosophy classes, humanities classes, critical thinking, religious studies, that's pretty easy to do online. I don't know how you do a class that requires a lot of interaction, close interaction between teachers and students about physical objects. I don't know how you shift that online as easily and maintain a lot, but we can do what we can. Mark says a lot of solid effort here in South Africa by universities to cooperate with big tech firms to provide better internet computer access to less privileged students, setting a good precedent moving forward. That is really great to hear, especially since South Africa, I think we can say, is still a developing country. A lot of populations. I mean, one of the interesting things in the one of the sources that I gave you, I'm blanking on the title of it, but it's about things worldwide. It's talking about India, right? Internet access is a real problem in India. A lot of people don't have access to it, or they don't have reliable access, or they don't have devices that can be effective for education. You can do education on a phone, but I think a tablet is way more helpful, and a laptop is even better. So we don't have anything like that, unfortunately, here in the United States. Again, lack of leadership on the top, too much localism, massive inequalities. Maybe corporations are the people that need to do that. Retro Gamer says, thanks again for my amazing philosophy teaching output. Enjoying the return of my Hegel lectures very much. Thanks. And thanks for the little contribution there, a little bit of a birthday gift, I'll call it. Right? So my birthday's in 9 days from now. I'm turning 50. Never thought I'd be this old, man. back to this. All right, Nfomi. This may sound sci-fi, but if you could, this is interesting. This is a really interesting idea. This may sound sci-fi, but if you could replace advertisements with educational facts, force businesses to use their packages to help with education. Okay, so, educational facts, that's bits of information, and obviously that's not the same thing as an education, but it sure would be helpful, wouldn't it? I mean, it gives you a lot more to work with. Let's say it was like, today it's going to be history facts, right? And a lot of history stuff is like people finding out that they didn't learn this thing over here. Like, for example, I'll give you a fact about Wisconsin. Did you know that Wisconsin almost seceded from the Union prior to the Civil War? It wasn't just the southern states that wanted to secede. It was our sixth governor, Randall Alexander, who is a very strong abolitionist. And he said, if Lincoln doesn't win this 1860 election, we're out of here, Wisconsin. And obviously Lincoln did win, and Wisconsin contributed more than its fair share of troops to the war to fight the Southerners who were seceding. But now, did you know about that? I actually found out about that by seeing a plaque about a terrible accident that killed a whole bunch of people coming up from Chicago. They were coming up from Chicago to stir up trouble here in Milwaukee about this secession problem, right? And then I started reading about Randall Alexander, and I was like, wow, that's cool. So, if these facts could spur further, like if they included a thing like click here for more information, that would be amazing, wouldn't it? If corporations even did that half the time. Like if we said, hey, if you want to advertise, you can advertise, but half to 1/3 of your advertisements actually have to be like public service announcements that will be about learning. Another thing that got brought up recently, what if, and apparently Mexico is doing this, what if we just like ran lectures? They could be we could make them interactive in certain ways by the way that you design lectures. What if we just ran those on television stations like 24/7 and kids could tune into them, if they're stuck home from school? And some older people, when I posted that, because I didn't post that as my proposal. Somebody else had proposed that, and I was like, this is a great idea. And I remember there being things like that on PBS. The previous generation, boomers, here in Milwaukee at least, on Channel 10, they used to have educational programming like that. That, by the way, was the initial idea behind television, that it would be an educational thing, not just about, streaming reality TV and talk shows and stuff like that, but actual education. So, all right. Tice says, I agree entirely. I saw this wonderful diagram of morality. Oh, yes, you're thinking of the Venn diagram. Kantian, utilitarian, virtue ethics. They all came to the same conclusion, put a mask on. Yes, that's quite correct. The only thing that would really, the only moral theories that would be against that would be a weird variety of libertarianism that had zero connection with sort of like social or public interest, or pure egoism, So Bana Kazooie says, what do you think about a 24-hour government television program for education, something like Sesame Street for high school? Yes, that is exactly what we were just talking about a minute ago. I think that, that should be something that we could produce. You think about how inexpensive that sort of thing is to produce compared to the high production for the BS that's on TV most of the time. It's easy. And you've got like a ton of people who could go on TV shows. Granted, some of them would not be very good. You weed them out, right? You get the ones, there's probably thousands of Lamar Burtons out there who could be tapped and, let's say you pay them good money, 100 grand a year, right? You're not paying them like what you pay actors and actresses in Hollywood. Um, just pay them something decent and good health care and stuff like that, and then they get to talk about their passion, whether it's bugs or finances or whatever. It would be amazing. We could easily do this, and the government could pay for it if we didn't have so many people who are like, oh, I don't want the government involved in this sort of thing. Yeah. All right. Ron says, why do you think conservatives have been so bad when it comes to wearing masks, combating the virus in general, when they were so vigilant when it came to countering the terrorism after 9/11? So I'm going to say something paradoxical. Most conservatives, those who call themselves conservatives, are not conservative at all. They are authoritarian and they are libertarian in weird ways. They're not really conservative, because genuine conservatives would give a shit about their community, want it safe and healthy, and would be doing their best to try to preserve some sort of common good. Does that map on to most people that call themselves conservatives today? Not really. There's a lot of groupthink on their part, I would say, just as much as we can find in the left and center left. There's probably some people who are wearing masks just because all their neighbors are, and because they think it's the trendy thing to do and something like that. And there's a lot of people who are not wearing masks because they don't have the balls to actually do the right thing when their neighbors aren't doing the right thing. And then there's a lot of them who are engaging in kind of wishful thinking. There's this desire to return to normalcy, a normal that was never really that good except for a few people. And then there's the whole, this is tyranny sort of nonsense. I mean, one of our Supreme Court justices, an educated woman, presumably, actually used the word tyranny to talk about the governor saying people should wear masks. That's insane. She should be committed, for writing something like that. That's not conservative at all. That's just some weird, whacked out, morphed from the Tea Party into Trumpism sort of thing. And the real issue is, how are we going to get these people out of this? What's going to happen to them? This party is not going to hold on to power forever. What are we going to do with all these people who have essentially engaged in a big group brainwashing session with each other for years and years now about these crazy talking points? All right. Let's see what else we got here. ID says, the people nodding along to New York Times anti-racist hysteria in the official months of January, February have now successfully framed themselves as moral authorities. It's disgusting. What's truly amazing, the Democrats have forgotten it's their sick globalist ideology. When you start spouting stuff like that, I don't take you seriously at all. I read that and I'm like, I don't know what the hell you're doing here. Obviously, you're just trolling. So all those things like globalist, that's a substitute for thought. You label people like that. All right. Let's see here. Zeno says, what are my thoughts on universities charging the same tuition for online education? Is there any justification for this, or are they just being greedy? Yeah, there's a justification. To begin with, tuition is tuition. Room and board is for staying on campus. You want to pay for the college experience? That comes out of your room and board. If you think that face-to-face classes, masked up, trying to stick to corridors that you're supposed to walk in during times, and sitting hopefully at least 6 feet away from your fellow students is going to be the same college experience that people are used to paying for, and that online education done well is somehow not as good, man, that's a stretch. Now, saying that the sort of pivot to online was just as good as face-to-face, no, it wasn't, because a lot of instructors don't know how to teach online. Some of us have been doing it for almost a decade. People try, my online courses fill up very quickly because people know they're going to be better than a lot of the face-to-face classes that are being offered. What we need to do is train up a whole cadre of people who can do online education well, and that is worth paying for. What I think is ridiculous is the fact that when I teach for Marquette, now I'm going to let you in on a little bit of the economics of teaching as an adjunct and the money that they're making as an adjunct. When I teach for Marquette, I get paid around a little over $4,000 for the class. Each student in that class is being charged $4,500 for the class. So you can tell it's not going to professor salaries. By the way, professors at Marquette not being hired at really high rates. Some of them are being hired at as low as $37,500 per year. So that money is going into the administrations, paying for new buildings, new gyms, athletic programs, all that sort of stuff, right? Those students are paying $4,500 for that class, whether it's online or face-to-face. If it's my online class, it's good. If it's my face-to-face, it's good. At Milwaukee Area Technical College, they're paying, not, I wouldn't say 10% of that, but maybe 15% of that. Now, I'm not getting paid as much to teach a class at Milwaukee Area Technical College. They pay me about $3,000 a class there. At Carthage, I get $3,500 a class to teach that class, to design it, teach it, build it, turn in the grades. And each of those students is probably getting charged about $3,800 for that class. Now, it doesn't matter whether it's online or face-to-face. Is this a good system where I'm teaching the same class for Marquette as I'm teaching for Carthage, as I'm teaching for Milwaukee Area Technical College? I don't skimp on the MATC students. As a matter of fact, I'm teaching some in prisons, right? Through that. They're all getting really the same class experience, except, maybe it's a little bit nicer on Marquette or Carthage campus. Carthage is a beautiful campus. Is this fair? The students don't really know about this until I tell them about that. They also don't know that most of the money isn't going to paying the professor, but rather getting siphoned off into all these other things. I don't think that we ought to be saying, I don't think the conversation really ought to be, should we pay just as much for online as we do for face-to-face? I think the conversation should be, should we pay as much for this, either kind, as we do for this? Is Marquette education really that more valuable than MATC is? I don't think so. So, yeah. All right. Bano Kazooie, going to be hard to put woodshop class online. Yeah, that's a tough one. And if you'd said, you could say marginally if it metal shop class, but even metal has weird impurities, and it's good to have somebody looking at it and saying, hey, this is how you got to fix this sort of thing. My great uncle Hubert was a master welder, and I have two family members currently right now in the Ironworkers Union down in Indiana, and the stuff that they do is pretty amazing. It's tough to teach that sort of thing without face-to-face interaction, but people do learn through YouTube tutorials. So, all right, Retro Gamer, happy birthday, Dr. Sadler! Congratulations on your longevity. Yeah, hopefully I'll make it like another 30 or so, maybe longer. It's kind of sad to think that maybe the majority of my years are behind me, and I probably pissed a lot of them away doing dumb stuff. Right? But, that's the way it is for so many of us, right? Let's see here. JB says 50 is survivable. We've had irrational exuberance in British Columbia. Oh, that's too bad. Where we had cases down to just over 10 a day back in June, but now we're back to 50 plus. Any philosophy that helps with this backlash? Yeah, I think a lot of this is one of those things where I forget who was just pointing it out. The Venn diagram, right? With ethics, virtue ethics, deontology, utilitarianism. Wear a mask, right? I think when it comes to philosophies that provide an intentional way of living, whether it be Platonic, Aristotelian, Stoic, Christian philosophers who have a bent like that, like Boethius or Augustine or Anselm, or even Epicureans, They all provide us with some sort of thing, some sort of techniques that help us deal with living in an irrational world where rationality stems from other people and their bad decision making processes. And it also helps us look within and find our own irrationalities and conflicts that we might want to not just look at but start working on, so like we don't get so pissed off when people do dumb stuff. We don't need to respond necessarily in that way. Like Seneca says in On Anger, anything that we can do with anger, if we're properly trained, we can do with practical reason, and then we don't have all of the baggage that comes with anger, like spillover and targeting the wrong people and all those sorts of things. So, all right, Gautam, what's the science about kids being vectors of COVID? I've seen articles that kids aren't good vectors of the disease and that they're good enough vectors to increase COVID spread substantially. There's two things you need to think about. One is kids getting infected. The other is kids just not washing their frickin' hands and, touching the same rails and coming into the house and bringing that crap in, right? So, and it's not just the kids getting infected at schools. You need to think about the staff, whether it's secretaries or lunch people or custodians. You need to think about the teachers. All of those matter as well. We do know that for like K through 12, except taking high schoolers out of there, some of the science seems to show that high schoolers are getting more and more susceptible. Makes sense because they're getting closer to being adults, right? But let's say we take elementary school kids. Okay, so not that many of them are going to get sick, and many of them are probably going to have good prospects. Then again, if only like say 0.1% of them get sick, and you're the one who made the decision about that, and you have a school district that has 1,000 kids in it, you've said that it's okay for that kid to get sick and maybe die from it. That's it. We really ought to be sort of doing what we call what is it? Is it Minimax or Maximin? I always get those two mixed up. We should be reducing the amount of risk possible, right? And then when it comes to high schoolers and it comes to college age kids, it goes further up. I mean, we're going to see. So the high school that made the news because they had all these people packed in, they already have a number of kids, high school kids, who have now tested positive for COVID, and 3 staff just within like a week, right? What's it going to be like a month from now? So these are the things we want to think about. All right, let's see here. What else have we got? Just skipped a little bit. Good or ground, having education online for free to use is a necessary prerequisite for post-scarcity. Yeah, that's true. It may be a necessary prerequisite, even if we don't go the post-scarcity route. And what we're talking about here, post-scarcity, refers to a future where we're not all having to work. And as a matter of fact, many of us won't have to work. And our basic needs would all be provided for, and we wouldn't be like, competing for them or stuff like that. So to some people, this is very utopian, but that may be where we're headed. I mean, ideally, that would be great. One of the things that we do need to think about is, well, what do we do with people, human beings, when they're no longer working and no longer engaging like that? Do we just like let them sit around and play video games all day and eat chips and I guess take walks and Zoom with each other once in a while? Is that sort of lifestyle going to not work for a lot of people, and they're going to be like, I need some excitement. Let's bust some stuff up, Education could be a major part of that. But I think even if we don't have a good post-scarcity future, and we have something that's a bit more dystopian, you're going to need some education, and it's probably going to have to be free, All right. Retro Gamer. But the institution is doing the marketing to get the students for your class. Oh, yeah, sure. And the marketing is sometimes done well, and the marketing is sometimes done poorly. But the marketing can be done, fairly cheaply. when I was teaching for Marist College, and I was teaching online, the reason why the reason why most of these educational institutions got into online teaching in the first place was not actually because they love people and they want to expand access and they care so much about their students. It was economic. It was what we call a cash cow. Same thing, by the way, when I was teaching in the prison system. I'll tell you about the prison system first. So when I was teaching for Ball State University in the Indiana State Prison, um, and I'd have 20 students in a class. 2 of those students were paying for my salary. The rest were paying for other stuff, like the use of the prison and all that. 10 of them were pure profit. Pure profit. The school was like making tons of money on top of that. That's why Ball State had 120 professors in the prisons. Ka-ching. It's the same thing for online education. The reason why Marist College and Marquette later on and all these other places got into online education is because it is so incredibly cost effective. And they realize that, do you actually need buildings? You might need an office. What you really need are servers. And that's not that expensive. And you need an IT staff, and you need people who are trained to do that, teaching online and stuff like that. Now, granted, physical stuff, sure. But if you actually look at where a lot of the money in the universities has gone into, it's not gone into their classrooms for humanities classes. It's gone into new athletic facilities. It's gone into souped up dorms and cafeterias. It's gone into administrator salaries. And it's gone into paying coaches lots of money. So, for the face-to-face classes, you can say, yeah, they're providing the infrastructure. Some of the money that you're making for them goes to pay for that infrastructure. The rest goes to all these parasites, or unnecessary building projects where the money's never going to be gotten back. So, yeah, we could do a whole thing about the economics of education here in the United States that I think would be kind of mind-blowing, especially for people not from the States. All right, let's see what else we've got here. Gutter says marginal cost of distribution is near zero once content is created. Yeah, I think that's true. You do need to update things every once in a while. You do have preserving the digital content because it does sometimes degrade. But you're right, it is pretty low. Now, that's not to say that a lot of people are worried that if I record content, then I'm going to be replaced. No, man, not if you're a good teacher. If you actually interact with your students in a regular way, students do still crave some one-on-one time, or 12-on-1 time, or even 50-on-1 time with an instructor who cares about their topic and can talk about them, with some passion and some competence, and who's going to help them along their educational journey. So, yeah. JB says, interesting parallels here with publishing ebook versus print, self-publishing. Lots of people think that ebooks should be really cheap, but actually the main cost is not materials. Yeah, I guess that's true. You're kind of paying for talent, right? Now that means a lot of ebooks probably ought to be really cheap because some of them are not very good. So, and textbooks, man. This is a whole different talking point. Textbooks ought to be way cheaper than they are because they mostly suck. But the textbook manufacturers really jack up the prices on them. I was looking at so I'm teaching medical ethics this fall, and I haven't taught medical ethics for a long time, and I had to look at textbooks that I was going to use for this class for Carthage College, and holy crap, are those textbooks expensive. And so I went with something really inexpensive, paperback. It's still $50 for the students, unfortunately. And they won't even the company won't even send me a physical copy myself. They just gave me an ebook for it, so I'm going to have to buy a copy myself. All right. JB says author's cut in traditional publishing is small, but you get advertising and so on from that though less nowadays. Authors have to self-promote. Yeah, even if you're with, so we're getting a little bit outside of the educational field, but even if you're like, even if you're doing something with one of the big publishers, you as the author have to go out and promote. And as a matter of fact, when you write a book proposal, they want to see that you've got a social media presence and that you have an ability to promote your book. They don't want to take a chance on you unless they think they're going to get you to do that sort of stuff. So, all right. Zeno, why is philosophy not taught in the K through 12 system as a necessary course? Yeah, that's a great question. So it is in some countries. France is a prime example. Portugal is another great example. Some of my videos are used in resources for the Portuguese national curriculum. We don't do that here in the United States. If you do get a philosophy class, it'll either be because you're in a religious school, and it usually gets taught as a religion elective, which doesn't mean it's getting taught in a religious way. It just means that's how they do it. Or you're in a rich public school, and it gets taught as a humanities or social sciences elective. And we just don't have it because it's never been there as part of the K through 12 education for public schools. It should have been. I mean, I don't know why. I don't know that much about the history of that, quite frankly, and I should dig into that. Now it's too hard to get new stuff into the school unless you can like give an example of exactly how it's going to pay off for the students and job, vocational stuff. So it can be taught as an elective, and you can smuggle it into stuff, like an English class or a history class, but I don't think we're ever really going to see it become part of the school curriculum here in the United States, sadly to say, right? Let's see, what else we got here? Mark says, has there been any initiative to get feedback from parents and students about things? Do they want to go back to face-to-face sessions, or is it just the institutes making decision on behalf of all? That's a great question. So again, no continuity, no uniformity. Each of these are doing their own thing, right? So I have seen some schools claim, for example, Carthage College, that the students want this, that they've done polling among the students. I don't know if it's true. I don't know if they polled 10 students or 100 students. They didn't release that information. They just said, we're making these decisions. Marquette did this too. Marquette said, oh yeah, the students are totally in favor of this. Talking with students, myself, and so this is purely anecdotal, they don't seem so jazzed about going back to school. Except my daughter, of course, who's like, I can't wait to get the hell out of Indiana and up here to Milwaukee and like get on with my life, no longer in high school, and now I'm in college, right? But that may fade fairly quickly too. I don't know. So yeah, I would like to say that we actually had some sort of sentiment testing, but I don't think there's anything that's really going on with that, So, all right, I think I may have missed somebody, so I'm reading up. Tara asked a good question. What are your thoughts about a statewide mandate for virtual public education? So if you mean like a state that we have here in the United States, like Wisconsin, it's just not going to happen. We don't have the political will to do that. We're effectively gridlocked right now. Like I said, the Republicans control the legislature because of gerrymandering. Gerrymandering so bad that the case actually went to the Supreme Court, and then the Supreme Court decided, again, dominated by Republicans, not to take the case. So we're stuck with this really screwed up system. The Wisconsin legislature has not met for months because the Republicans are unwilling to do anything. So we don't have the political capacity to do statewide mandates really for anything right now. Other states, maybe they could, and you'd be talking about blue states, because the red states are the ones where they're like, let's open everything. So, I mean, you could do it like in Massachusetts, maybe. New York would be tough. Jersey would be tough. California is such a big mess anyway. I don't know that they can do it. So I don't know. I think it's kind of a non-starter here in the United States, unfortunately. And since we have almost zero, no useful leadership at the federal level when it comes to this, until Betsy DeVos is out of the Department of Education, I don't know what we're gonna do. So yeah, let's see if there's anybody else that I missed. Bana Kazuzi, do I have a video teaching in prisons part two? No, I never did a follow up on that. I'll probably have to do some about that, especially since I'm still teaching in prisons now, but I'm doing it remotely through the Second Chance Pell program, through Milwaukee Area Technical College. Anybody else that I missed? Mark said, behavior of staff and bureaucrats is setting as an example to students, which I feel is component to education. That element shouldn't be overlooked. Well, the example that they're setting is, we're going to have our meetings about you going face to face remotely, but you're going to go face to face. So the example is, we're going to make the decisions for you, but we're not going to actually like live up to that stuff ourselves because we're high risk, And what example does that provide? Well, functioning adults are hypocrites, and everybody should like be out for themselves. If we're going to treat this present generation the way that we are, we shouldn't be surprised when we're old people and they're like, screw you. It won't be screw you boomers because the boomers are dying out. It'll be screw you Gen Xers. We don't need you. Let's put you out on the ice. If that's what we're gonna accept for them. All right, let's see if we got some other stuff here. Thomas has a kind of off-topic thing, but I'll answer it. What's my favorite drink to have in a bar? How much can I bench? I don't know, because when I do machines when I'm working out. I'm always a little bit suspicious of people who think that how much you can bench is an important thing. I actually like to drink beers, and I used to brew beer quite a bit myself for years. And I live in a great place for local craft beers. We have one of the oldest American craft breweries here in Wisconsin, in Milwaukee, the Sprecher Brewery, which recently was sold as the original founders changed hands. So, all right. Retro Gamer, the American Catholic institution has much to offer. The dialogue about right reason as a moral agenda. St. Henry Newman's canonization is a testament to the cultural reverence of scholars. Yeah, I guess. I mean, most Catholic schools are not really Catholic, quite frankly. I mean, Marquette, it bills itself as a Jesuit school. You would never guess by the decision-making processes that they go through. And the veneer is very, very thin these days. And it's also reflected in how they've changed the core. We're down to just one philosophy class and one theology class in the core. Used to be you had to take a number of them, and this is the case for a lot of Catholic institutions. They're not really Catholic in any genuine sense, any organic sense, you might say, which is unfortunate. But what are you going to do? I guess you got to look for alternative institutions. Do the Benedict option, but not the Rod Dreher Benedict option, but the genuine, Benedict option that McIntyre was sketching out. David says, you've spoken to your favoring of physical books over ebooks for obvious practical benefits, but how do you look ethically at the pirating of ebooks for the financially fraught, or e-textbooks? Frankly, I don't have any problem with textbooks being e-pirated. I would say, in a sort of deontological way, well, it's still wrong, but it's so much less wrong given all the other things that go into it than other things that I'm not gonna care. Likewise, I don't care when I see that Philosophy Documentation Center or Elsevier journals get pirated. They can, if they have a problem with that, given all the profits they're making, they can handle it. I care much more about the little person and how they're being affected. Now, if we're talking about like ebooks being pirated, not e-textbooks, but like let's say somebody writes a great ebook about, I don't know, The Good Life, right? Should you be pirating that? I would say no, no. You should pay the royalties to the author. Now, when we get to things like books that are put out by Kluwer or Brill, and they cost like $200 for the book, there I care less, right? But if it's like some person wrote a book, that's their passion, and they published it on Amazon self-publishing, I don't want to see them getting screwed. So I'd make some pretty big distinctions there, And for me, some interesting questions here. Do you think automating some subjects could be of use? And what about outdoor classes over loudspeakers? I think I saw a story on India doing that. So outdoor classes, that can work in temperate zones. It's interesting. I'm seeing these places that are doing outside classes, and they're like in New England, and I'm like, how the hell is that going to work come November? You're going to be outside. I don't get how this is going to happen. Maybe then the thing to do would be like to have here. I mean, here's an idea that nobody seems to have tapped yet. So, what if we actually had for each classroom, we socially distance, we wear masks, but we all have mics. Now, granted, you have to clean up the mics after each use and stuff like that. Mics and like headsets, and we're all on one channel, and we find a way to filter out the coughs and the heavy breathing and stuff like that people would do, right? Maybe you need a sound person to handle that, but you could have some of those sorts of things going on, right? I don't know. Maybe that's a way to make it feasible. Automating subjects, I'm not sure what automating means. So I think that you can certainly develop educational resources that could be shared, like videos. If that's what you mean by automating, that's been going on for quite a while, right? Let's see what else we've got here. Some discussion about peripatetic education. So the Peripatetics, Aristotelians, right? Aristotle used to walk back and forth as he lectured, peripatine. But again, it's tough to do that once it starts to turn winter here in Wisconsin. And I think with these outside things, you might also have some issues of accessibility. Students can be subject. Some students might be subject to allergies when it's hay fever season. There's issues that we'd have to work out. Kyle, have you noticed any differences between your students in prison versus university in terms of attitude towards coursework? No, it's really about the same, I would say. You have kind of a bell curve, right? Most of the students will do most of the work, and they won't do a great job on everything. And then you have the real go-getters. Give me more work. Let me do everything as well as I can. And then you have the slough-offs on the other side, where they're like, no matter what you do, they're destined to fall themselves through the cracks because they don't want to do any of the work, and when they do it, it's going to be shoddy and stuff like that. And you have the same issues of plagiarism arising, or trying to cheat, at about the same rates, I'd say. So I had a couple cases of academic dishonesty, but I always have some cases in the other places where I'm teaching. So. All right. Here's an interesting point by Lyle himself. There's tons of stuff online being pirated, and the online economy is doing great and booming, so I don't think pirating stuff is a problem. You can save the money to support small content creators. That's actually the second part I really like, right? So instead of it being like, oh, I'm going to pirate stuff and then, screw the system, man, I'm just going to be a consumer. You help out the smaller groups. Sort of like what I was saying, so we did this on the River West Radio show, Wisdom for Life, Dan and I, in episode 19, which was about moving from rights to responsibilities and thinking about free speech. We were talking about a practice. If you think that a conversation is not worth engaging in, then the person's going to be arguing in bad faith. Just disengage. But then you can use that time and attention and devote it to a better conversation, right? So what you're talking about here is kind of similar. If you're going to save money by not paying for textbooks that are just going to support, Macmillan or Palgrave or whoever, maybe save that money and do spend it on small content creators. Buy some ebooks from somebody who is writing some decent stuff, or I don't know, chip into somebody's Patreon for their podcast, or things along those lines. I think that's actually, we could generalize this and say it's not just enough to do X. Maybe we ought to be reallocating priorities. The point I was making on a larger scale about education and where we spend our money, but maybe we can do that on a micro level too. All right. Let's see here. Well, we're getting close to the end of the time. I think I've answered everybody's comments and questions, the ones that are actually relevant to the situation, and the topic. Obviously, I'm not doing too much about other things having to do with working out, because this isn't really about that. Anything else that people want to bring up, or should we close this out here? I allocated 90 minutes for this. I got to do a lot of stuff today. So maybe we'll just end it here. I'm glad that people enjoyed the discussion. A lot of great proposals, a lot of really good ideas coming out of the woodwork here. Now, getting them to policymakers, that's a bit tougher. That is the challenge. But got to think a bit more about that. All right, so I'm going to say goodbye to everybody. And what else do we have coming up? Next week, obviously, the classic metal class on Saturday. And then I'm going to be having my birthday bash online on Sunday, in part because we thought the Democratic National Convention was going to be here with Biden. Now it's not going to be, and we weren't sure about what internet access would look like on my actual birthday. So, all right, that's it from my end, and I'll see all of you somewhere else in another discussion.